A reading from the book of Exodus. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not make a wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Honor your father and mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. When all the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, they were afraid and trembled and stood at a distance and said to Moses, You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, Do not be afraid. For God has come only to test you, and to put the fear of him upon you, so that you do not sin. Here ends the reading. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Our grandson Tristan is continuing to grow and to mature. Right now, he's reached the point where he is walking and toddling around all over the place. And as he does so, his horizons of life are beginning to be expanded, and so are the opportunities for him to get into trouble. His favorite word combination right now is uh-oh, when he sees something going wrong or when he looks at the debris field around his high chair after dinner. Our most frequent word is no. And usually that registers enough to stop him long enough for one of us to swoop in and pick him out and get him out of the potential trouble that he's about to get into. We have been a family of adults for many years now, and we are relearning the value of boundaries, of rules, and setting limits. Because Tristan is fearless. He's always had someone hovering over him. He doesn't know what harm can come to him if he is left unattended. And so these rules and boundaries begin to make sense, not to hedge him in, but to provide for him a safe space in which to thrive and to grow and to continue to become who he will be. That is an experience that we have all through life. There are rules and regulations all over the place. I was raised in the Presbyterian church as a child, and one of the things that the Presbyterians do at their General Assembly every time they meet is to spend an inordinate amount of time amending the Book of Order, which is really the manual of operations and procedures for the entire church. And I never understood why they put so much energy into debating words and phrases and where a comma goes, and why every year they had to meddle with what was essentially a book. Until I sat on a church and ministry committee for my first time in the UCC. And the first problem that was presented to us was one of a minister who was giving gifts, extravagant, extraordinary gifts, inappropriately to the congregation. And it was a way to sort of endear or obligate or put in thrall the members of the congregation so that this minister could pursue their own agenda and maybe have the people who had been given these extravagant gifts sort of support the agenda or at least not oppose it. The deeper we dug into this situation, the more my skin crawled at how creepy the coercion and the manipulation was on the part of the minister. We did not have a whole series of rules and regulations like the Presbyterian Church. We are dependent mostly on having people with experience and wisdom sitting around the table, deliberating how to move forward. And if you're in the situation where I was young and naive on this church and ministry committee, well, then you just sort of have to sort of rely on the grace of God to blunder through it. Fortunately, our national setting of the United Church had just published a code of ethics for ministers. And we picked that up and started reading through it and started checking off where we thought this code of ethics was being violated in this situation. And because of that, because of those boundaries and limits set within the code of ethics, we were able to effectively respond and resolve the situation and help this particular church move forward. That is true of all life, even all throughout all church history. There are rules and precedents and traditions that we observe all through life. And when you really begin to peel back why these rules and these traditions and these boundaries are there, there often is a backstory that will explain why we do things the way we do them. Sometimes the backstory has fallen out of the tradition and out of consciousness, and we're left with an action or a practice that seems to have no grounding and doesn't seem to make much sense. I remember as a child that ham used to come in these big egg-shaped oval-type cans. And when my mother wanted to reheat one, it came with a key that you sort of had to unwind the lid off and pry it off and then let it sort of slide into the skillet. I remember when my mother did that, she always sliced off both ends of the ham. I couldn't figure out why she did that. After all, was it about getting the gelled aspic off? If that was the case, then the gelled aspic was on every surface, not just the top and the bottom of the ham. And so I asked her why she did that. And she told me, well, my mother used to do that. So the next time I was over at my grandmother's house, I brought up what I'd seen with my mother, and I asked her, so why did you do that? And she told me, well, it's because that's what my mother did. Well, it turns out that my great-grandmother lived right next door to my grandmother. So I went in the backyard and through the hedge over to my great-grandparents' house, and I asked my great-grandmother why she did that. And she just smiled and said, well, we weren't all that well off back then, and the cans the ham came in were bigger than the skillet I had to put into the oven to warm it up, so I had to chop off the ends to make it fit. Oh. Sometimes recovering the backstory of a tradition, a rule, a boundary, or a limit will explain why we do it. And then once we have that backstory, we can begin to explore whether or not that is a valuable tradition to carry forward or not. We have in our reading this morning the Ten Commandments. And I think many of us have a Cecil B. DeMille version or understanding of the Ten Commandments. We see Charlton Heston in the great movie, The Ten Commandments, going up the mountain. There is lightning and thunder, and in a dramatic way, God carves letters and words on these tablets of stone, and Charlton Heston, as Moses, brings them down to the people. These things are sort of textus receptus, received text from God, and we do not question them. But as with any rule, regulation, limit, boundary, tradition, I wonder about the backstory. And I'd like to do a thought experiment for a bit and ask you to suspend the God-given origins of these Ten Commandments, but to reflect on what they are trying to tell us. What are the lessons that have been learned that are carried forward in these Ten Commandments? Well, think about it. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall make no image of me. Well, where did the Israelites come from? They were living in Egypt that had a multiplicity of gods and many images of gods. Everything was deified, from natural forces to human impulses and emotions. And many times these deifications were sort of half human, half beast. Well, I think you are what you worship. And if you worship something that's half bestial, then you are going to be living a beastly kind of life. And the life that you project on others will be just as beastly. And if you have a multiplicity of this kind of bestiality, what kind of life is that going to result in for you and for everyone in society? You shall rest. You shall observe Sabbath. Well, why is that important? Well, slaves, back in the ancient world, did not merit rest. You shall not steal your neighbor's wife, or husband, or possessions, or livestock. Why? Because slaves had no right to lasting relationships. Slaves had no right to property. Anything a slave possessed could be taken away in an instant. And Israel is not to live that way. Honor your mother and father. Old slaves are not productive and therefore disposable. To honor mother and father is to respect the sanctity of life, and that is extended by the command, do not murder. Life is sacred. All life is sacred. You shall not lie. Compulsive lying creates chaos and gives rise to a situation where powerful people can rise and take control and sets up the establishment of tyranny, which leads to slavery. If you look at the Ten Commandments, the backstory are the lessons that are learned in the land of Egypt. And as God liberates the people of Israel, seeing the oppression and the injustice, these rules are meant for them to follow, so that as they become a nation, they do not become like the Egyptians and oppress and enslave. That they are able to live within God's righteousness, within God's justice, within God's peace, and therefore live as free people under God. What are the lessons that we have learned recently over the past 7 months as we have lived through this pandemic? I think first of all, our first lesson was stick together. We, by coming together, can endure and survive as a people better than we can by ourselves. Don't hoard. There is enough for all. Hoarding deforms the soul and leads to greed. Live with compassion towards each other. Wear a mask. Wearing a mask is a way of loving one's neighbor by saying, if I have COVID-19, then by wearing a mask, I am making sure I am not spreading it to you. Be generous. We have seen how our acts of generosity in helping our mission partners with their food pantries has led not only to extending life to those who have less, and extending our resources and resourcefulness to them, but has limbered our soul and has energized our congregation. Respect life. We have seen how this pandemic has been harsh on those who are vulnerable, on those who have been pushed off to the side or pushed down in our society. And the measure of our greatness as a people is shown by the extent that we hold up those who are vulnerable and pushed away or pushed down. Trust God. God walks with us. God goes before us. God goes behind us. God is with us. Trust God that God will uphold even when we cannot see what the next week or the next month will bring us. God is with us. And because God is with us, dream big. Because our God is a God not only of our past and our present, but our future. And because we trust God, we can have dreams for how we can thrive and continue to be God's people and a blessing to our community, even in the future. We can make those dreams and those plans now. And if you add up all those things that we've kind of learned so far from the pandemic, they oddly resonate with the Ten Commandments as a way to provide a pathway for people to live with righteousness, to live with justice, to live within God's peace, and to make the world into the vision for the way God would have us live as human beings. To live not as slaves, not as people oppressed, but as people living in the fullness of life that God intends. As we continue to march through this pandemic, may we carry forward the lessons that we have learned. May we put them into practice. May we continue to dream big, because our God is bigger than anything that we endure. God bless you this week and all the weeks to come. Amen.